This is the Wake Up Podcast, powered by Veeam. I'm your host, Rick Vanover, the Rickatron. And today, joining us with fresh perspectives to wake up to is Greg Wetmore. Thanks for joining us, Greg.
My pleasure, Rick. Great to be here.
So, Greg, take a moment, introduce yourself, your role, and tell the viewers about yourself.
Thanks. So, I'm Greg Wetmore. I'm the head of product development for the digital security solution segment at Entrust. For anyone who doesn't know Entrust, we're a cybersecurity technology company. We base our technology on identity security. We help our customers protect their people, devices, and data.
I love that. Real short, simple, and focused on something really important, identity. So top of mind for sure with the era we live in, AI and more. We'll get into that. But let's start with kind of a probing question. You know, Greg, I've been working this series for this Wake Up podcast on the fundamental premise that maybe data is untrustworthy, and I'm getting all types of different perspectives here. And I'm using the word data loosely. We can scope it to identity if we want to. But what's your knee-jerk reaction to my challenge that data is untrustworthy today?
Well, we spend a lot of time thinking about identity, and you're right to think about that connection between identity and data. In organizations, identity systems create structure, but that shouldn't be confused with certainty.
That's a really interesting one. Then, when you say certainty, I have some ideas of what that might mean, but what would your definition of certainty be in that sense?
Well, one of the things we're seeing is that challenge organization is facing managing their identity systems. Identity has exploded way beyond people. We're sort of almost through a multi-year cycle of pretty significant change in IT infrastructure, the virtualization and cloudification and changes in how applications are built and interact through APIs. So the world of non-human identities has actually exploded well beyond multi-times people identities today. And organizations are challenged to manage that. It's operational challenge, and it's a risk. They don't have the visibility. They can't really see what's going on in their organizations for the most part.
You kind of gave a really good example here. Non-human identities, a phrase that has been made almost a household name from AI standpoint, but I would argue that's been in place for a while. You mentioned APIs, and I think those are some of the more earlier non-human identity examples.
We're just entering a brand new phase here with agentic AI that really blurs that line between human and non-human identity. Agents are taking action across organizations, operating on data on behalf of potentially human. So that blurring of the line, we're really entering a new world of non-human identity with agentic AI.
And now, I'm not trying to scare the viewers away, but this new world, I think, takes some significant intentionality. And how would you kind of advise an organization to just understand this phenomena right now?
Sure. So that, I guess I'll speak a little bit about some of those tough challenges we're seeing out there. The explosion in the amount of data, your company is absolutely right in the middle of that. The explosion in the amount of devices and connected devices, this new world of non-human identities. Organizations are really struggling both on the operational side and the risk side and compliance side of that equation to manage those identities. Visibility, I'll come back to that, is a massive concern for organizations. It's really hard to fix problems, identify compliance risks, identify operational challenges and risks unless you have that data, have that information, have the visibility into those assets.
I'm going to take a page out of my I have a whole bunch of phrases and expressions. It's a little book. I call it the Rictionary. But I'm going to take a page out of the Rictionary here and really double down on what I call explainability. And I think for people that might, first of all, acknowledge that there's this non-human identity, there's this risk, and there might be knowledge gaps, right? My advice is to really work on the explainability of solutions and what they've implemented, and maybe start small, right? Don't try to boil the ocean just yet, right? But start with a small part of the infrastructure, get that part right, have some explainability. That comes up a lot when I talk about new AI agentic workflows, explainability is a good thing. But I think from an identity standpoint, explainability might be a good place to start.
Sure, I totally agree. When organizations make decisions about risk, about compliance, they're operating on imperfect information, yet they're expected to make perfect decisions. That's a real challenge. That explainability, that visibility, that having the right information at your fingertips to be able to make timely decisions is critical.
So speaking of timely, I think there's also a risk that there will be a time that something breaks down. And tell us maybe some examples of that moment of where those breakdowns happen in real life. And I think people kind of fall into explainability because they have to fix an incident. Maybe walk us through the moment that someone wakes up to a breakdown.
So when safeguards start to fail, it's not just data that's exposed, it's assumptions that are exposed. We see that organizations who face some of those challenges around the safeguards they have in place start to make really conservative decisions that can skew business outcomes when they don't have the ability to go to market the way they want to go to market or expose the information to their customers that they want to expose. So it's that real critical balance between conservative risk-based decision-making and business enablement.
So Greg, I think it's super important when we put all this work into building a solid platform, a solid solution with identity in mind. But what happens, what are some of the thought processes that organizations go through when things break down? They thought everything was certain and set, but you never know what tomorrow will bring. What goes through their minds?
So of course what we see is just about every breach gets tied back to some form of compromised credential. So it immediately calls into question the integrity of the trust system that supports the digital infrastructure in an organization. People automatically think of, do I need to go reset my passwords? And I think that's the sort of simplest form of recovering your digital identities after a breach. But if you scale that up and you think about perhaps having to onboard all of your employee base back into those trust systems or even all of your customers, you immediately start to think about how resilient, how scalable, how secure are the workflows I use to onboard my employees. We think of KYE, know your employee. How do you know the person you're onboarding is who you think they are? How do you know what entitlement they should have? Is that process for issuing them new credentials secure and safe in the context of a breach? KYC, know your customer. If you're in the financial services industry, that's something that you live every day. But many organizations now today, even outside of finance, are thinking about how do I know my customer when they onboard to those digital systems, and what mechanisms, what security checks and controls do I have in place to do that? And can I do that at scale after a breach when I have to perhaps onboard everybody all at once? Some of the things that organizations are thinking about today when things break down.
This is something to wake up to, because this is a very big risk that potentially every business technology organization has right upon them, and they just might not know that. That's interesting. What about identities, especially in the non-human manner? Take an incident, take a forcing function that makes someone have to go through these drills. Are these harder to interpret, or are they kind of underestimated in their impact, the non-human identities and other aspects? I mean, because you can't just blame it on Joe. It might be the agents of Joe. It might be the APIs of systemadmin.joe. I mean, it really makes everything a little bit more complex.
Yeah, I totally agree. And today's world, the non-human part of identities has grown tremendously, and it's multiple times the number of non-human identities that are around organizations today than people identities. And I would say that growth has been so extreme and so fast that most organizations don't have the technology, the people, the process, and the technology they need to manage those non-human identities in their organizations. And it creates a risk, as you describe it. Do you have the ability to see what those identities are doing across my organization? Do I have lifecycle management to be able to rotate the cryptographic assets that underlie all of those digital identities in a secure way, in a best practice way? I would say most organizations tell us that they don't really have the capabilities that they need to manage this sort of new world of non-human identities.
You mentioned best practice, and really without accident or without intentionality, you and several other of the guests this season have mentioned that phrase, people, processes, and technology. That is a best practice that's coming quite clear throughout this series. So I love that it just kind of comes up that way. One of the other kind of angles, I think, that I'd love your perspective from an identity perspective that organizations have to deal with is around just in compliance. And the thought is, well, hey, I've been through an audit. My infrastructure was marked as compliant to XYZ standard. I don't know. Bad things can still happen there. Is that a false sense of security, or is that just a stepping stone on a journey?
Yeah, I think of compliance as the floor.
Oh.
Compliance isn't the strategy,
Wow.
or shouldn't be the
Yeah.
strategy. If compliance is the bar you're shooting for, I think you're shooting at the least common denominator. You're shooting at the floor as the goal. So I would say the most sophisticated organizations we deal with think of it that way, and their strategy takes them well beyond compliance, and they're thinking about some of the future risks that are coming down the pipe. Things like AI and deep fakes and synthetic identities, things like the quantum threat to the cryptographic assets that protect all of our identities. It's that strategic thinking, I think, that the most proactive organizations are focused on.
Let me give some advice to the folks at home. The moment you go into your next audit, do not refer to the compliance to the auditor of we're aiming for the floor. I don't know if that's a good approach. I think that might skew your output of the audit. One thing I can tell you, Greg, I joke a little bit with that. I used to work in financial services, and I went through some audits as well. And what I've learned is the compliance doesn't, okay, I'd say a different way. The compliance doesn't mean you're secure or
Right.
you're ready
Yeah,
for
and
something.
that's the sentiment I was going for.
It just meant that from what's been implemented and how it's been audited, it will, align to that assessment. That's what it is. Does that mean you're ready for a disaster? No. Does that mean you're ready for an attack? No. Fire, flood, and blood. Cybersecurity, agentic AI threats, these three kind of progressive generations of risks to data. Don't tell your auditor our goal is to be the floor. Do not do that. But no, I love that perspective here, so that's awesome. Now, when you look at climbing the competency stack of readiness, let's call it that, from the floor, what would you say changes in an organization? Is there an attitude? Is there a mindset? Is there investment? What changes on the more successful organizations in identity in particular?
Yeah, I talk about three things. Do I have the ability to find my identities? Like the cryptographic assets that support those identities. So do I have the visibility? Do I have an inventory? Can I control them with policy? So find, control. Do I have the ability to highlight risk areas? Do I have the ability to measure against whatever policy framework my organization falls under? Is it healthcare? Is it finance? Is it national security? Is it critical infrastructure? And finally, do I have the ability to automate? Can I automate the lifecycle management of those identities and those cryptographic assets that support those identities? Best practice really calls for things like least privilege and decommissioning identities that aren't being used and rotating keys and certificates and secrets at high frequencies. All of those best practices, can I automate that across my organization? So that find, control, and automate concept, to me, is that higher bar that the more sophisticated organizations are thinking about now.
You hit on something that I probably would assume is a surprise to many organizations. You said, let's inventory our identities. How many times do they not even know what identity services they have? Is that common?
Yeah, it's just about every time. Every time we're part of an engagement where inventory or discovery is part of what we're trying to do, every organization's find things that they don't expect.
And
everyone.
I will lean on some data that Veeam publishes. So I don't know, Greg, if you know, or the viewers, but in 2023, Veeam acquired a company called Coveware, which is an in-house incident response services as well as some software tooling to help in that everything from identifying a blast radius to some other unique technology. And there's also a massive data pipeline that they keep across these threats. But one of the consistent themes, Greg, is they always talk about modes of entry. Phish, remote access not done well, and updates or vulnerabilities being exploited. Updates not done, vulnerabilities been exploited. I've been looking at this data since I think 2018. Those three just kind of trade as top mode of entry, and then the TTPs that come into play always involve an account, an identity takeover. So I think that you started with inventory of identities, and then I'm coupling it with what we're seeing here at Veeam in the market about these threats. And I got to think that's an absolute wake-up moment to understand the inventories of identities that orgs may have.
Sure. It's all just impossible to fix a problem you can't see.
Yeah, and like, I got to think the most shadow inventory of identity out there probably aligned to something that's really important as well. It's not, let me give an example, like, maybe some third-party solutions, maybe even company social media. You could think of like identities there that you could defame an organization with that. I mean, there's just, I guess I'll put you on the spot. What's the most surprising identity that an organization didn't know they had?
Well, I guess I'll turn that a little bit. I think context is everything. A weak key or a overused password in a test system, it's a problem. It's not a best practice, but is it going to take your business down? Probably not. Yeah. But when you find that kind of problem in your the most valuable long life data that's in your organization, or your HR systems, or your commercial systems, or your the system that's holding all of your intellectual property, or supports the entire key business process for your organization, that context is everything. So it's not just about inventory, it's not just about finding these, it's about being able to pull the context of where is this being used, and how does that data affect our organization, how do the applications that sit around that data, how important are they? So that really is how you actually see that risk heat map, or be able to zero in on the high priority problems, is being able to match that context with what you find. And that can be a challenge.
Oh, I'm sure. I think it's going to take some patience. It's going to take some, you might or might not have organizations get a little bit protective or egotistical, like there's nothing wrong, we don't need your help. I don't know if you've ever had someone tell you that. But I think that in the end, all organizations agree that they want to reduce risk. And how would you help organizations prioritize that risk reduction in an identity context?
Sure. So actually, frankly, organizations are pretty good about managing risk. Boards of directors and senior leadership teams are built around that concept of managing risk, and they're good at it. They're pretty good at it. I think the challenge is to be able to feed that decision-making team with the right information. I go back to that. You have to make perfect decisions with imperfect data, which is a real challenge. So around identity, it comes down to, do I have that visibility? Can I see the identities in my organization? Do I have the context on how those identities are cryptographic assets that support those identities? How are they being used? And can I match that against the policies, the compliance controls that affect my organizations? Can I identify that risk heat map around identity to support the decisions that a board of directors or a senior leadership team have to make? Because of course they have to balance priority, they have to balance finite budgets and where they spend their dollars. So for us, it really is trying to help our customers generate that context-sensitive, risk-focused map of where the problems are in the organization around identity.
That risk-focused map, and if you take the landscape today, non-human identities, maybe imperfect data, does that destabilize the trust, or is now the time to kind of correct it before we have worse things happen?
It feels a little bit like a forward-looking kind of question, Rick. There's a couple of sort of coming trends that I'm seeing that are going to affect identity pretty significantly over the next couple of years. Maybe we can go there a little bit. One of the things we see is a massive growth in how deepfakes and synthetic identities are affecting the identity ecosystem. At Entrust, we commission a study every year. We call it the Identity Fraud Report. This year's study showed us that 1 in 5 biometric fraud attempts were tied to deepfakes. 40% increase in injection attacks. So that's where AI-generated data is injected into some form of an identity transaction. So just pretty scary, massive growth in what AI is allowing fraudsters to do at scale. Create synthetic identities, create document forgeries, create deep fakes. So it's sort of attacking some of those fundamental trust signals that we rely on, even as people. What am I looking at? What am I hearing? Is this something I trust? Is suddenly under attack. And then in the world of cryptography, or in the world of keys and certificates, those cryptographic assets that support all of those digital identities, we're concerned about the quantum threat, something we've talked together about before, where over the next few years, the traditional cryptographic systems that we rely on to protect the integrity of our data, the confidentiality of our data, the trust in our digital identity systems is potentially going to come under scrutiny from a scaled quantum computer. And we're going to have to change some of the underlying infrastructure, that the wires and pipes that protect all of this stuff are going to need to change over the next few years. So it's some of those forward-looking technology trends that boards and senior leadership teams are going to start having to think about and perhaps prioritize some investment to update their systems to be resilient.
Well, I agree on that. And holy buckets, I got to check out that report. What's the report name again?
It's the 2026 Identity and Fraud Report from Entrust.
Okay, I will check that out. I love data points like that because it aligns very well to what Veeam is doing, and especially on the PQE side as well, for sure. Greg, thank you so much for this incredible insight.
It's been my pleasure, Rick. Thank you.
All right, that wraps today's episode of the Wake Up Podcast powered by Veeam. Find this episode and more at a podcast platform near you, and additional fresh information to wake up to at veeam.com.